Most people picture King George IV as a fat, foolish dandy in tight breeches, the Prince Regent of the comic prince, a man who built a silly oriental palace by the sea and was rightly forgotten. But the real story is darker and far more expensive. By the time the Royal Pavilion at Brighton was finished, George had spent over £500,000 on a single seaside house. He had married 2 women, hated one of them in public, and locked the other out of her own coronation. And when he died, his country's leading newspaper printed an obituary that began with a sentence, "No king has ever survived." If you enjoy the stories the history books leave between the lines, subscribe so you never miss the next one. Stay with me. The pavilion is only the beginning, and the man inside it is far stranger than the building. Chapter 1. The Prince Who Wanted Everything. He was 18 years old, 6 feet tall, fluent in French, and already £20,000 in debt to a single actress. The Prince of Wales, the future King George IV, was born on the 12th of August, 1762, the eldest of 15 children of King George III and Queen Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. His childhood at Buckingham House and Kew was watched over by a father who believed in plain food, plain clothes, and plain duty, and a mother who believed in piety and embroidery. The boy who came out of that house was none of those things. He was beautiful in the way princes are described in fairy tales and almost never are in life. He had fair skin, blue eyes, and the kind of long-limbed posture that looked impressive in a uniform. He spoke French and Italian. He could draw. He played the cello, sang a fair tenor, and could recite long passages from Shakespeare and Dryden by heart. His tutors complained that he could do anything he wished, and wished to do almost nothing. What he wished to do was to be admired by people his father disapproved of. By the age of 17, he had attached himself to the leaders of the Whig opposition, in particular Charles James Fox and Richard Brinsley Sheridan. By the age of 18, he had fallen, hard and publicly, for Mary Robinson, an actress at the Theatre Royal in Drury Lane, whom he had seen in the part of Perdita in Shakespeare's Winter's Tale. He wrote her letters under the name Florizel. He promised her £20,000 on coming of age. He paid £5,000 and a yearly annuity of £500 to get the letters back. He was, before he had his own household, already in debt to women, to tailors, to silversmiths, and to wine merchants. On his 21st birthday, Parliament granted him £50,000 a year, and his father added another £60,000 to set up his own house. Carlton House, a stripped-down old building on the south side of Pall Mall, was placed in his hands. Within 3 months, it was being remade by the architect Henry Holland into a French neoclassical palace with painted ceilings, gilded boiseries, and a domed entrance hall. By the end of 1786, 3 years into his majority, his declared debts stood near £250,000. He was 24. His father refused to pay. His brothers, the Dukes of York and Clarence, refused to lend. Parliament was asked to step in. Parliament asked, in return, for an account of how the money had been spent. The prince refused to provide one. This is the man, sketched in his first decade of adulthood, who would later build the Royal Pavilion at Brighton. He was clever, sentimental, indulgent, and incapable of refusing himself anything. He had been raised to believe that being a prince meant having everything, and he had concluded, very young, that being liked meant giving everything away. In the autumn of 1783, a physician called Dr. Richard Russell had been recommending sea bathing in a Sussex fishing town called Brighthelmstone on the south coast for the cure of swollen glands. The prince was suffering from swollen glands. In September 1783, he went down to take the cure. He found a small town of perhaps 2,000 people, set between chalk downs and a grey sea, where no one knew his face well enough to bow. He found that he could swim. He found that he could walk on the beach in the morning without ceremony, take a private dinner in the evening, and sleep under the sound of the waves. He went back again in 1784. He went back again in 1785. By the autumn of that year, he had decided that he wanted a house there. He had also decided that he wanted something else. The question that would sit under the rest of his life had been formed. What does a prince build when his only real ambition is to be loved? Chapter 2. A marriage no one could see. On the 15th of December 1785, in a drawing room in Park Street, London, the heir to the British throne committed a crime. Her name was Maria Fitzherbert. She was 29, 6 years older than the prince, and twice widowed. Her first husband, Edward Weld, had died after only 3 months of marriage in 1775. Her second husband, Thomas Fitzherbert, had died of a chest complaint in 1781. She was discreet, quietly devout, and a Roman Catholic. She had a small fortune of her own, of about £2,000 a year, and a house in Richmond. She had no intention of becoming a king's mistress. The prince had first seen her at the opera. He had courted her openly through the spring and summer of 1784. She had refused him. He had taken to his bed, claiming to be dying of grief, and had sent his physician to her with the news that the Prince of Wales had stabbed himself with a sword and would not live unless she came at once. She came. She found him bleeding, or appearing to bleed, and she promised that she would marry him, if marriage between them were possible. The next day she fled to the continent. He pursued her in letters. By the autumn of 1785 she was back in England. He was in London. He had given her a written promise of marriage. And on the evening of the 15th of December 1785, in a drawing room she had hired for the purpose, the Reverend Robert Burt, a clergyman of the Church of England, who had been let out of debtor's prison for the night on a payment of £500 by the prince, read the marriage service over them. There were 2 witnesses, her brother John Smythe and her uncle Henry Errington. There was no license. There was no banns. There was no royal consent. The marriage was, on the face of it, a wedding. In law, it was nothing. The Act of Settlement of 1700 provided that any heir to the throne who married a Roman Catholic forfeited the throne. The Royal Marriages Act of 1772, passed by the prince's own father in response to 2 of the prince's uncles marrying without permission, provided that no marriage of any descendant of George II under 25 could be valid without the king's written consent. The prince was 23. Maria was Catholic. He had not asked his father. He had committed 2 simultaneous offences against the British Constitution. He went on as if nothing had happened. He set Maria up in a house in Pall Mall, near Carlton House. He visited her every day. The fashionable world saw what was happening and concluded that she was simply his mistress. Friends who knew the truth were sworn to silence. Maria herself believed the marriage was real in the sight of God, if not the law of England, and conducted herself as a wife. By 1787, the prince's debts had reached a level Parliament could no longer ignore. He owed more than £250,000, equivalent to roughly £35 million in modern money. His political friends, the Whigs led by Fox, agreed to introduce a motion for relief in the House of Commons. The trouble was the marriage. If Parliament voted to settle the debts of a prince who had secretly married a Catholic, the king would refuse to give the bill royal assent, and the whole Whig leadership would be destroyed. The marriage had to be denied. On the 30th of April 1787, Charles James Fox rose in the Commons. Acting, he said, on the authority of the Prince of Wales himself, he declared that the rumour of a marriage between His Royal Highness and Mrs. Fitzherbert was a calumny without foundation, a thing not only never done, but never even thought of, and that it ought to be treated by every honest man with the contempt it deserved. He sat down. Parliament voted to grant the Prince £161,000 to settle his debts, and an additional £60,000 to complete the work at Carlton House. The grant passed within the week. The next day, Maria was visited at her house by a friend who brought her the report of Fox's speech. She read it in silence. When she looked up, she said only that she did not believe the prince could have said such a thing. She was wrong. He had said it. He had said it deliberately, because he knew it was the only way to be paid. He came to her later that day. He swore that he had been betrayed, that Fox had spoken without his authority, that he would publish the truth himself in the morning. He did not publish the truth in the morning. He published nothing. The marriage went on quietly and bitterly for another 8 years, and the country, for the most part, never quite believed it had not happened. This was the first lesson of his adult life. He had bought £161,000 by denying his wife, and the price had been paid by another person. He would learn that lesson again and again. Chapter 3. A farmhouse on the Stein. In the summer of 1787, while Parliament paid his debts, the prince was busy with something far more interesting than money. In October 1786, more than a year before the Fox denial, the prince had sent his clerk of the kitchen, a German confectioner called Louis Weltje, down to Brighthelmstone to find him a house. Weltje was, in addition to his official role, a property speculator. He took a lease, in his own name, on a small farmhouse owned by a man called Kemp, set on a piece of open ground in the town called the Stein. The lease was held by Weltje. The prince was the tenant. By the spring of 1787, the prince had instructed Henry Holland, who was finishing Carlton House for him, to remake the farmhouse on the Stein into a seaside villa fit for the heir to the throne. Holland was a sober, methodical man. He had built Brooks's Club for the Whigs and the Pavilion at Cadland for Robert Drummond the banker. He was, in 1787, the most fashionable neoclassical architect in London. He drew up plans within a few weeks. The new house took the shape of a letter E. It was 2 stories high and timber framed for speed. Holland clad it in cream-coloured mathematical tiles, a hard glazed tile cut to imitate stone, fixed in vertical courses across the entire external surface. From 30 feet away, the building looked as if it had been built of Portland stone. From 3 feet away, it was visibly tiled. At the centre, Holland set a circular drawing room, 20 feet across, crowned with a shallow saucer dome supported by 6 Ionic columns of polished marble. Bowed wings reached out on either side, with full-height sash windows looking east towards the sea and west towards the town. An Ionic portico marked the western entrance. The house had perhaps 12 principal rooms, with offices and kitchens in a separate wing to the north. Work began in April 1787. The building was structurally complete by the end of June. The prince took possession on the 6th of July, before the paint was dry. The cost was approximately £20,000, paid largely out of the parliamentary settlement that Fox had bought him by denying his marriage. Brighton itself, the town which would shortly be remade by the prince's presence, was at that moment changing faster than any town in England. In 1760, it had been a fishing village of about 2,000 people. The introduction of regular coach services from London, the publication of Dr. Russell's treatise on the medical uses of seawater in 1753, and the prince's own visits had begun a transformation that would carry the population past 20,000 by 1820. By the end of the 1780s, 1 in 3 houses in Brighton was a lodging house or hotel. The prince's household followed him down at his command. Maria Fitzherbert, who had not been seen at Carlton House for some weeks after the Fox denial, was set up in a small house called Stine Cottage, less than 200 yards from the new pavilion. She came in to dinner most evenings. The fashionable world followed within a year. By 1790, the Marine Pavilion was already too small for the prince's purposes. The Princess Royal complained on a visit that the bedrooms were poky and the dining room cramped. Within a decade, Holland had been asked back to extend. By 1799, the wings had been enlarged, the entrance pushed forward, and the central saloon enlarged. A new conservatory had been added. The cost was rising. The prince's debts were also rising. In 1793, Weltje formally leased the property to him at £1,000 a year. In 1795, on the eve of the Caroline marriage, the prince used part of the new debt settlement to extend the lease and the gardens. In September 1807, by then long married to Caroline and long estranged from her, the prince finally bought the freehold of the property outright from Weltje's trustees for £17,000. By that point, Holland was dead. The prince was 37. The pavilion was a comfortable, fashionable, almost respectable seaside villa, costing perhaps £40,000 in total to that date. The country had not yet noticed it. The prince was not yet satisfied with it. He had already begun, in his head, the second pavilion, the one which would be impossible to ignore. What followed at Brighton would be unlike any other royal building project in British history. Henry Holland's polite cream-coloured villa, the modest first house in which the prince had taken his swollen glands to be cured, was about to disappear inside an oriental dream paid for by a country that could not afford it. And the man who would build it, the man on whom the next 30 years of George's pleasure depended, was at that moment a 60-year-old architect in London who had been twice bankrupt and was about to be hired by the most expensive client in Europe. Chapter 4. The wedding night the country never forgot. On the 8th of April, 1795, 2 ministers of the Crown carried the heir to the throne up the aisle of the Chapel Royal because he could not walk. By the autumn of 1794, the Prince of Wales was, by his own confession, ruined. His debts had reached approximately £630,000, equivalent to between £80 and £90 million today. Parliament would not relieve him again without a price. His father set the price. The prince, who had been refusing to do it for 10 years, would have to marry a Protestant princess and produce an heir. The chosen bride was his first cousin, Princess Caroline Amelia Elizabeth of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel, the daughter of his mother's sister Augusta and of the Duke Karl Wilhelm Ferdinand of Brunswick. Caroline was 26. She was lively, blonde, slightly plump, talkative, and badly washed. The British envoy James Harris, sent to bring her over, noted in his diary that she changed her linen rarely, and that her conversation was unguarded in a way that would not survive London. He suggested as gently as he could that more attention to soap might be advisable. She laughed. The first meeting took place at St. James's Palace on the 5th of April, 1795, 3 days before the wedding. Caroline had been travelling for weeks. She had not been allowed to change her clothes properly. The prince entered the room expecting a bride. He looked at her, took 1 step back, walked over to Lord Malmesbury, and said quietly that he was unwell and that he would be obliged for a glass of brandy. He drank it, turned on his heel, and left the room. Caroline, when he was gone, sat down and asked of nobody in particular whether the prince was always like that. Malmesbury, who was the only witness, wrote the exchange down that night. The wedding took place at the Chapel Royal at St. James's Palace at 8 o'clock on the evening of the 8th of April, 1795. The Archbishop of Canterbury, John Moore, officiated. The prince had been drinking since the early afternoon. By the time the service began, he could not stand without support. He was held up between the Duke of Bedford and the Duke of Roxburgh. He stared at Lady Jersey and the congregation throughout the vows. Lady Jersey was his current mistress and had arranged the entire match in the hope of getting Maria Fitzherbert out of the picture forever. At the moment, when he was asked whether he would take Caroline of Brunswick to be his wife, the prince was reported to have hesitated, looked at the floor, and finally answered yes. What happened after the ceremony is known principally from Caroline herself, who told the story to several people over the following years. The prince was driven to Carlton House. He sat down on the floor by the fireplace. He continued to drink. He passed out by the grate, where the fire had been laid for the night. Caroline, who had been put to bed in the room above, eventually came down to look for him. She found him insensible. She covered him with a blanket and went back to bed alone. He came up at some point in the night. The marriage, on his own later admission, was consummated. It was consummated once. He did not return to the bed afterwards. Caroline became pregnant immediately. Princess Charlotte Augusta of Wales was born 9 months later, on the 7th of January 1796, after a labour of 12 hours at Carlton House. The prince held the child briefly. He looked at her. He went out, drank, and within 3 days had written to Caroline a letter of separation, the letter, which she kept and which her daughter read after her death, said that the prince hoped Caroline would be content with the separate establishment which would be made for her, that he had no further claim on her conjugal society, that she might consider herself in all respects free, and that he expected the same freedom for himself. He signed himself her affectionate husband. Caroline answered in 2 lines, accepting the separation and adding that she would expect to retain access to her daughter. She did not retain access. The prince saw to it. Princess Charlotte was placed in the household of governesses chosen by him. Caroline was permitted to visit her child once a week, in a public room, under the eye of a lady in waiting. She was forbidden to write to her without supervision. The child grew up with the impression, encouraged by her father, that her mother was a low and indecent woman who could not be trusted with her. Caroline retreated, first to Charlton, then to Blackheath, then in 1814 out of England altogether. She travelled through Italy and the Eastern Mediterranean for 6 years, with a small court that included an Italian courier called Bartolomeo Pergami, with whom her relationship was at least intimate. The prince's spies, paid out of the privy purse, followed her every step. They sent home reports. They paid Italian servants to swear sworn statements in which they had seen her in bed with Pergami, in baths with Pergami, in carriages with Pergami. The reports filled a green silk bag, which the prince kept locked in his desk, and which the country, when it eventually saw, refused to believe. By 1817, the prince had not seen his wife in 20 years. He had also lost his only legitimate child, but that is a story for a later chapter. He was at Carlton House, half drunk most evenings, dependent on opium for his sleep. At Brighton, the new Royal Pavilion was rising under the hand of John Nash. The prince had begun, in compensation for the wife he could not stand and the daughter he could not father, to build the only thing he could fully control. Chapter 5. The architect who promised the impossible. John Nash was 63, twice bankrupt, and had just been handed the most important architectural commission of his life. Nash had been born in Lambeth in 1752, the son of a millwright. He had trained in the office of Sir Robert Taylor. He had set up in practice in London in the 1770s, designing modest houses for modest clients. He had married a woman who immediately ran up debts in his name. He had been bankrupted by those debts in 1783. He had fled to Carmarthen in West Wales, where for 10 years he had rebuilt his reputation designing prisons, county jails, market halls, and country houses for the Welsh gentry. He had returned to London in 1796, lean, ambitious, and prepared to be liked by men in power. He had been taken up by the Prince of Wales in 1806. He had been given the commission for the Royal Pavilion in the autumn of 1815. Nash and the Prince Regent were, in temperament, perfectly matched. Both believed in the impressive over the practical. Both believed in carrying out the largest possible scheme on the smallest possible budget by undercosting at the start, overspending at the finish, and trusting the client to find the difference. Both believed that visual effect was what the world remembered, that practical detail was for clerks, and that a building was, in the end, a stage. What the Prince Regent wanted at Brighton in 1815 was not an extension. He wanted the Marine Pavilion to disappear inside something else, something nobody else in Europe had. He had been collecting Indian engravings since the early 1790s. He owned a complete set of the Oriental scenery prints published by Thomas Daniel and his nephew William Daniel. Between 1795 and 1807, 6 volumes of detailed images of Mughal palaces, tombs, mosques, and minarets, drawn from life across northern India. He had also been impressed by William Porden's new stable block at Brighton, which between 1803 and 1808 had risen behind the Marine Pavilion in an Indian style, with a vast brick and glass dome modelled on the Halle aux Blés in Paris. The stable block, with its 65-foot diameter dome, had cost just over £54,000. The Prince Regent had decided, on the basis of that bill, that an Indian pavilion to match was both possible and affordable. The Prince Regent was wrong. Nash began work in the autumn of 1815. The strategy was simple. The existing Holland Marine Pavilion was kept, structurally, and a new external skin in stone, iron, and stucco was wrapped around it. 2 enormous new state rooms were built on at either end. To the south, beyond the Holland House, came the banqueting room. To the north came the music room. Above, a roofline of onion domes, slender minarets, pierced screens, and chadja overhangs replaced Holland's saucer dome. The chadja, the deep eaves used in Mughal architecture to shade walls from sun, became at Brighton a wide projecting cornice on every level. The minarets, lined with cast-iron skeletons, allowed Nash to push the silhouette of the building higher than masonry could have managed on its own. The interior was handed to 2 men whose names today are barely remembered. Frederick Crace, the son of John Crace, came from a London family of decorative painters who had been working for the Prince at Carlton House since the 1780s. Robert Jones was a less established figure, recommended by Crace. The 2 men did not work together so much as in competition. Crace took the north wing and the central pavilion. Jones took the banqueting room and the south wing. Both worked in a wholly Chinese idiom, with scarlet lacquer walls, gilded dragons, false bamboo, simulated stained glass, and mythical landscapes. The result was a building wrapped on the outside in Indian forms and decorated on the inside in Chinese ones, with no apology for the contradiction. The cost rose every quarter. Nash's first estimate to the Prince had been around £50,000 for the whole transformation. By 1817, after 2 years, the figure was over £100,000. By 1820, it was over £200,000. by the time the interiors were declared finished in 1823. The total recorded expenditure on the building works alone, leaving out furnishings, was approximately £155,000. The total cost of the pavilion estate, including the land bought from Veltje, the stable block, the gardens, the kitchen, the fixtures, and the chandeliers, was approximately £503,000. In modern values, depending on the inflation index used, between £40 and £50 million. The radical press in London was already at work. In 1816, George Cruikshank had published a print called The Court at Brighton a la Chinese, showing the Prince Regent as a Chinese Mandarin idol surrounded by fawning courtiers, and Lady Hertford, his current mistress, depicted as an obese Chinese empress beside him. William Hone, the radical printer, had been publishing a series of pamphlets and parodies, including a parody of the Lord's Prayer, in which the Prince Regent stood for the Father, his ministers for the Apostles, and the Royal Pavilion for the Kingdom. The cartoonist James Gilray, before his death in 1815, had produced over 100 prints of the Prince, all hostile, all selling. The country outside Brighton was, in 1816 and 1817, in serious economic trouble. The end of the war with France in 1815 had thrown 200,000 demobilised soldiers and sailors onto the labour market. The harvests had failed in 1815 and 1816. The new Corn Laws of 1815, designed to protect English landowners, had pushed the price of a £4 loaf of bread to 1 shilling and 3 pence, perhaps a third of a labourer's daily wage. There were food riots in East Anglia in May and June 1816. There was a march by unemployed weavers on London in March 1817. There was a serious attempt to murder the Prince Regent in his carriage on his way to open Parliament on the 28th of January 1817, when a stone, or possibly a bullet, broke the window of his coach. In this country, in this year, the Prince Regent was spending tens of thousands of pounds on lotus chandeliers and silvered dragons. Nash, for his part, was paid no fixed fee. He took a commission on every contract he signed. He was therefore in an even worse position to refuse extensions than the Prince was. By the time the music room was opened on the new year of 1819, Nash himself was already worth, on paper, a very considerable amount of money. He would, in turn, lose it all on the construction of his own townhouses in Regent Street and Carlton House Terrace, and die in 1835 at his estate on the Isle of Wight, his fortune entirely consumed by his own building. The architect promised the impossible. He delivered something close enough to it that the Prince Regent never seriously asked for the bill to be checked. And the bill, when at last it came due, was sent to the country. Chapter 6. The Kitchen Built for 100 Dishes. On a January evening in 1817, the Grand Duke Nicholas of Russia sat down to a dinner of 127 separate courses. The Grand Duke Nicholas, who would in 1825 become Tsar Nicholas I of Russia, was 20 years old. He was on a tour of Europe arranged by his mother, the Dowager Empress. He had been in England for several weeks. He had been received by the Prince Regent at Carlton House. The Prince Regent had then taken him down to Brighton in order to display, in person, the new banqueting room and the new kitchen, which were both still officially under construction. The dinner of the 18th of January 1817 was, in effect, a soft opening. The chef in charge was Marie-Antoine Carême. Carême had been born in Paris in 1784, the son of a workman, abandoned by his family in childhood, brought up by a pastry cook called Bailey. He had taught himself classical architecture from books in order to design his own sugar centerpieces. By the early 1800s, he had cooked for Talleyrand, for the Tsar Alexander I at the Congress of Vienna, and for the Rothschilds. In 1816, the Prince Regent had hired him for an annual salary of around £2,000, an extraordinary sum for any household servant. A first footman in the same household earned between £30 and £40 a year. A scullery maid earned £6. Carême was being paid roughly 300 times what the lowest woman in his own kitchen received, and he stayed for 1 year. His menu for the Grand Duke survives. It is on display today in the kitchen at Brighton. It begins with 8 different soups, served in pairs, 2 of which were French-style consommes, and 2 of which were thick English purees. It moves on to 8 large fish removes, including a turbot with a Genovese sauce and a salmon in a court bouillon. It then offers 15 flying dishes, the assiettes volantes, which were small light dishes carried around between courses to keep the appetite alive. Then come 8 grosses pieces, the principal large set pieces of the meal, including a baron of beef, a saddle of mutton, and a haunch of venison. Then 40 entrees, which is to say 40 separate dishes, including chicken, game birds, sweetbreads, kidneys, and vegetables, served simultaneously in a great spread around the table. Then come 8 pieces montés, which were architectural sugarwork, miniature pavilions of spun sugar, marzipan and gold leaf, modelled on Greek temples and Chinese kiosks. Then 8 roasts. Then 32 entremets, the sweets and savouries between the main meal and dessert. The total is 127 dishes. The dinner ran for approximately 5 hours. The kitchen that produced it had been finished only the year before. It occupied a new wing to the north of the central pavilion, built in 1816 and 1818. It was approximately 40 feet long and 30 feet wide. Its roof was a high lantern of cast iron and glass, set with louvres to let the heat and smoke rise out. 4 cast iron columns rose to the lantern roof, each disguised as a palm tree, with hand-beaten copper fronds painted green at the top. The columns were structural. The palm trees were decoration. The combination was characteristic of every choice the Prince Regent made. Along one wall ran a steam table, heated from below by a tank of boiling water and used to keep finished dishes hot through the long serving cycle. Along the other wall ran a series of charcoal stoves, each with its own copper hood, used for the delicate sauce work that required a clean, smokeless heat. At the centre stood the great range, with a smoke jack above it, a small turbine driven by the heat of the fire that turned the spits through a system of pulleys and chains. The smoke jack meant that no human being had to sit by the fire turning a spit by hand. It was, in 1816, one of the most modern pieces of equipment in any kitchen in Europe. Off the kitchen ran a pastry room, a confectionery kitchen for spun sugar, a fish larder cooled by ice, a separate meat larder, a scullery, a still room for distilling lavender water and rose water, and a long row of dressers for laying out the food before it was carried out. A dish that left the kitchen had to travel about 100 feet through a corridor under the floor of the main house, then up a back stair, then along a service passage behind the banqueting room wall, before reaching the service door behind the diners. The corridor was lit by gas lamps. The food, even in winter, arrived hot, because the steam table at one end and the gas heaters along the passage kept it so. The hierarchy of human beings inside this kitchen was as strict as the architecture. Above all stood the chef, in Carême's year Carême himself, in plain whites with a black silk cap. Below him, a head pastry cook, a sauce cook, a roast cook, and a soup cook, each running their own table. Below them, sous chefs, each a specialist. Below them came the men who did the heavy lifting, the dressers and the carvers. Below them came the scullery maids and the kitchen boys, the lowest paid figures in the entire palace, who scrubbed the copper pans with sand and lemon juice, who plucked the birds and gutted the fish, and who worked from 4 in the morning to past midnight on a dinner of the Grand Duke's scale. Above the kitchen, in the body of the main house, ran an even more complicated hierarchy. The master of the household ran the daily ceremony. The Lord Steward's office ran the accounts. Below them, the groom of the stole, when the prince was king, oversaw the king's dressing. The butler ran the cellar, the silver, and the male indoor servants. The housekeeper ran the linen, the china, the women's quarters, and the housemaids. The master of the horse ran the stables, where William Porden's enormous dome housed 44 animals, with apartments above for the grooms and coachmen. At the height of a state dinner, the Royal Pavilion held approximately 150 servants in active employment. They lived in attic rooms above the state floor, in the basement, in lofts above the stables, and in lodging houses in the streets behind the pavilion. Their work was hidden as far as it could be hidden. The prince's guests entered through the porte cochere. They were led through the octagonal hall, with its stained glass dragon panel, into the long gallery, 400 feet of imitation bamboo lacquered red and gold. They were taken left into the banqueting room or right into the music room. They sat down. The servants who had carried the food appeared from doors lined with the same lacquer as the walls. The dishes arrived in silence. The plates disappeared in silence. The chandelier overhead, the great silvered dragon clutching its weight of crystal in its claws, had been lit by a man on a wheeled scaffold an hour before dinner, then drawn up out of sight on a system of counterweights. The dragon, motionless, looked down on 127 dishes. In the streets outside, on this same January evening of 1817, a 4-pound loaf of bread cost 1 shilling and 3 pence. In the country at large, in this same January, a spa field meeting in London had just demanded universal suffrage, and a series of food riots had broken out in East Anglia. Inside the banqueting room, the Grand Duke ate consommé. This was the moment of maximum tension. The pavilion had reached the height for which it had been built. The country had reached the height of resentment against the man who had built it. The chandelier and the smokejack and the dragon would not move from where they were. The country would. Chapter 7. The Death That Killed the Crown's Future. On the 6th of November 1817, after 50 hours of labour, Princess Charlotte of Wales died at Claremont House. Princess Charlotte Augusta of Wales was the only legitimate child of the Prince Regent and Caroline of Brunswick. She had been born on the 7th of January 1796. She had grown up watched by both parents and trusted by neither. She had been the subject of a custody battle from the moment she could walk. She had been allowed to see her mother only under the supervision of a governess. She had been raised in a separate household at Warwick House, behind Carlton House, and had been educated by a series of women appointed by her father. She was, by the time she reached 18, a tall, fair, lively, brave young woman, with a temper that ran in the family and a tendency to friendship with the underdog. She had been engaged in 1814 to William, the hereditary Prince of Orange. She had broken the engagement off in her father's drawing room in his presence, when it became clear that William expected her to live half the year in The Hague. She had then turned her attention to a German cavalry officer, Prince Leopold of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, a younger son with no money and a face she liked. After 2 years of pressure from his daughter, the Prince Regent reluctantly consented. The wedding took place on the 2nd of May, 1816. The couple were given Claremont House in Surrey, an elegant Palladian villa built for Lord Clive of India. Leopold was given a parliamentary annuity of £50,000. By the autumn of 1817, Charlotte was visibly pregnant. The country waited. She was 21. She was the only person in line for the throne after her father. Her health had been good through the first months. Her doctors, Sir Richard Croft as accoucheur and Sir Matthew Bailey as physician, were the most respected in London. The accepted obstetric theory of the period was the lowering treatment, in which pregnant women were bled, purged, and put on a low diet to keep their constitutions calm. Charlotte had been put on this regime for several months. She had grown weak. Her labour began on the evening of the 3rd of November 1817. It continued through the 4th, the 5th, and the morning of the 6th. Croft, following the principles of the lowering treatment, declined to use forceps even when the baby had visibly failed to descend. A stillborn boy, large and well-formed, was delivered late on the evening of the 5th of November. Charlotte was exhausted. She rallied briefly, asked for chicken broth, drank a little wine and water. She began to hemorrhage in the early hours of the 6th. She died at 2:30 in the morning. Croft, who had been the obstetrician on duty, shot himself 3 months later, broken by the failure. The Prince Regent had been at Carlton House when the messenger arrived in the afternoon of the 6th. He went into the room, sat down in a chair, and did not move for several hours. He was, on every contemporary account, more grief-stricken than any other public event of his life. He had loved Charlotte. He had also depended on her. She had been the one child of his only marriage. She had also been the one secure heir to the throne in the next generation. Her death meant that the entire dynastic future of the British monarchy was thrown back onto his unmarried, aging, mostly illegitimate brothers. None of them had a single legitimate child between them. What followed was, in retrospect, comic, although nobody at the time thought it funny. Within a few months, 3 of the prince's brothers had abandoned their long-standing mistresses, found German princesses of the appropriate age and Protestant faith, and married them in haste. The Duke of Cambridge married Augusta of Hesse-Kassel in May 1818. The Duke of Clarence, William, the future William IV, married Adelaide of Saxe-Meiningen in July 1818. The Duke of Kent, Edward, married Victoire of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, the widowed sister of Charlotte's own husband Leopold, also in July 1818. From the Kent marriage came, 11 months later, a daughter born at Kensington Palace on the 24th of May 1819. They called her Alexandrina Victoria. The Prince Regent went down to Brighton at the end of November 1817 and stayed for the rest of the winter. He held no public entertainments. He sat in his small apartments at the south end of the pavilion. He read. He drank. He was visited by his confidante, Lady Hertford. He listened to music in the unfinished music room. He did not return to London for some months. There is a quiet truth at this point of the story which is easy to miss. Until the death of Charlotte, the Royal Pavilion had been the setting for a particular kind of future. It had been the country house of the Prince Regent, and through him the future setting of the Prince's heir, and the granddaughter or grandson he expected at any moment. After the death of Charlotte, the pavilion lost its forward momentum. The prince was 47 and grossly unhealthy. He had no living legitimate child. He had not lived with his wife for over 20 years. Whoever inherited the British throne after him was now going to be the child of one of his despised brothers, raised in another house, in another household, in another tone. The pavilion was, from November 1817 onwards, a house with no inheritor. He returned to it the following season. He commissioned more decoration. He installed the dragon chandelier. He held the Grand Duke Nicholas dinner. He opened the new music room on New Year's Day 1819. But every act of magnificence after Charlotte's death had a different colour to it, a different weight. The building was no longer being made for a son or a daughter. It was being made for the man inside it. He came back to Brighton, alone, and the gates closed behind him. Chapter 8. The Queen Who Would Not Disappear. In June 1820, the woman the king hated most in the world sailed back to Dover to claim her throne. George III had died at Windsor on the 29th of January 1820 after a long and dignified disappearance into madness. His son became King George IV at the age of 57. He had been regent for 9 years. He had been Prince of Wales for 57. He had spent his life waiting for the crown. The moment it arrived, the question of his wife arrived with it. Caroline of Brunswick was now, in the eyes of every law of the land, Queen Consort of the United Kingdom and Ireland. She had been in Italy and the Eastern Mediterranean since 1814. She had been living openly with Bartolomeo Pergami, an Italian courier turned chamberlain. She had been spied on by Hanoverian agents employed by her husband. She had received, in early 1820, a tentative offer of £50,000 a year to stay out of England and forfeit her place at the coronation. She refused. She landed at Dover on the 6th of June 1820. She entered London on the same evening. The crowds in Westminster cheered her into Alderman Wood's house in South Audley Street. The unpopular king received the news at Carlton House and ordered his ministers to find a way to be rid of her. The ministry of Lord Liverpool, who had no enthusiasm for any of this, was instructed to bring forward a bill of pains and penalties in the House of Lords. The bill, introduced on the 5th of July 1820, sought to dissolve the marriage on grounds of adultery and to deprive Caroline of her title. The Lords agreed to hear the case in person, the equivalent of a public trial. The hearings began on the 17th of August 1820 in the chamber of the House of Lords. What followed lasted 3 months. It was the most spectacular public trial of the early 19th century and the worst public humiliation any modern British monarch endured. The ministry's case was presented by the Attorney General Sir Robert Gifford and the Solicitor General Sir John Copley. Their evidence was the green silk bag of sworn statements from Italian witnesses, paid agents employed by the Milan Commission, which the king had set up to gather material against his wife. Caroline's defence was led by Henry Brougham as Queen's Attorney General and Thomas Denman as Solicitor General. Brougham was the most aggressive and most loved advocate at the English bar. He destroyed each Italian witness in turn. He showed how they had been paid, how their statements had been translated and retranslated through 3 languages, how the chambermaids and waiters of small Italian inns had no clear memory of doors opened or beds occupied across the night, and how every fact in the green bag could be matched by a similar fact in the green bag of the king. That last point was the crisis. Brougham held, in reserve, a brief which Caroline had given him with the right to use it if attacked. The brief contained the evidence of the king's own adulteries, his open keeping of Lady Hertford, his open keeping of Lady Conyngham, and the existence of the 1785 marriage to Maria Fitzherbert. If Brougham had presented that brief in open court, the king's claim to the throne would have been called into question, because a Roman Catholic marriage of an heir to the throne under the Act of Settlement forfeited succession. Brougham hinted repeatedly that he could present it. The ministry hesitated. The crowds in London grew larger. The procession of Caroline's carriage to the Lords each morning, escorted by men with drawn swords from the city wards, became a daily protest against the king. The bill was passed on its 3rd reading in the Lords on the 10th of November 1820 by only 9 votes 210 to 99. Lord Liverpool, on the same evening, stood up in the Lords and announced that the bill would not be sent to the Commons, where its prospects were hopeless. The Queen had not been formally cleared. The King had not formally divorced her. The case was withdrawn. London erupted. For 3 nights, every window in the great squares had to be lit with candles in Caroline's honour, on pain of having the glass broken. The illumination of London on the 10th, 11th, and 12th of November, 1820, was the largest spontaneous expression of public feeling in the city since the celebrations of 1798, after Trafalgar. Caroline was driven through cheering crowds. The King refused to come out of the rooms at Carlton House for several days. The King had been at Brighton for much of the trial. He had been receiving daily reports. He had been writing letters of complaint to Lord Liverpool. He had been kept supplied with brandy and opium by his physicians. He had been kept company by Lady Conyngham, who would, by the following spring, be installed openly at the pavilion in apartments connected by a private door to his own. By the time the bill was withdrawn, he was drinking heavily and could not get out of his chair without help. He was, in his own house, in the rooms he had built for his pleasure, hiding from the woman he had not lived with in 25 years. Caroline, for her part, knew that she had won the public battle and lost the private war. She had been refused a place at court. She had been refused an income above a small allowance. She had been refused a coronation. She continued to push, through the spring of 1821, for the right to be crowned with her husband at the ceremony fixed for the 19th of July. The ministry equivocated. The King refused. The trial had revealed something the country would not forget. It had shown the King's evidence to be paid, the King's witnesses to be unreliable, the King's own conduct to be worse than his wife's, and the King's private life to be exactly what the radical press had been claiming for 30 years. It had shown, above all, the limits of personal monarchy in the new age. A king who could not produce evidence of his wife's adultery without the country laughing at him was no longer a king to be respected. The pavilion stood through the trial. The dragon overhead, the lotus chandeliers, the silvered fronds of the palm columns in the kitchen, the long bamboo gallery, all stayed where they were. The man who had built them was hiding, with the curtains drawn, in a small apartment in the south wing, waiting for the news from London. The Queen, who would not disappear, was for the moment in possession of every square in the capital. The coronation was still 9 months away. The King had to find a way through it without her. Chapter 9. The coronation she could not enter. On the morning of the 19th of July, 1821, prize-fighters dressed as pages turned the Queen of England away at the door of Westminster Abbey. The coronation of King George IV was the most expensive ceremony of its kind, held in modern British history. The estimated cost was approximately £243,000, equivalent to between 25 and 30 million pounds today, 4 times the cost of his father's coronation in 1761. £100,000 had been voted by Parliament. The remainder came from the war indemnity France had been required to pay under the Treaty of Paris in 1815, set aside by Lord Liverpool's ministry for the purpose. The hired jewels alone cost approximately £375,000. The frame of St Edward's crown, dating from 1661, was set with diamonds, sapphires, rubies, and pearls hired from London jewellers, all of which were returned after the ceremony. The new coronation robes, designed by the King himself in a Renaissance Italian style with a 27-foot velvet train, cost an additional £24,000. The state coach, the gold plate, the food, the wine, and the lighting cost between them another £50,000. Scaffolding inside the abbey accommodated 4,656 guests, 3 times the seating at any previous coronation. The king's own person, on the morning of the 19th, was as carefully prepared as the abbey. He had been put on a diet. He had been corseted. He had been laced and powdered. He had been given mild opium and a small glass of brandy to steady his nerves. He had been helped into a velvet doublet of crimson, a robe of cloth of silver trimmed with ermine, and over all, the long train. He walked under a canopy carried by 12 barons of the Cinque Ports from Westminster Hall to the Abbey. He was, in the open air, sweating heavily, although the day was warm rather than hot. He had to be supported discreetly on both sides. Caroline had been kept informed of the arrangements through her advocates and her household. She had been refused a place at the ceremony, refused a robe, refused a procession, refused a seat in the abbey. She had been advised by several of her friends, including Brougham, not to attempt to attend. She had decided to attempt it anyway. She believed that to absent herself was to accept that she was not the Queen. To present herself was to force the issue. She arrived at the west door of Westminster Abbey at about 6 o'clock in the morning in a glass carriage, dressed in a low-cut dress of white satin and a diamond bandeau. She had no ticket. She was met by 2 prize fighters, professional boxers in the pay of the Duke of Wellington's office, who had been hired in civilian clothes as door pages for the occasion. They informed Her Majesty with perfect politeness that without a ticket she could not enter. She moved to the north door. The same answer. She moved to the south door. The same answer. She moved to the Poets' Corner door. The same answer. At one door, a single member of the public called out to her, asking her to go away. The crowd which had cheered her at every appearance for the past year was, on this single morning, silent. She got back into her carriage and was driven away to her house in Hammersmith. She did not appear again in public. She fell ill that evening with a violent pain in the stomach, which her doctors diagnosed as an inflammation of the bowel. The pain did not subside. She lingered for 19 days. She died at Brandenburg House, Hammersmith, at 25 minutes past 10 on the evening of the 7th of August, 1821. She was 53. Her last spoken request was that her coffin be inscribed Caroline of Brunswick, the injured Queen of England. The Hanoverian government, which owned her body, refused. She was buried in Brunswick in her father's vault. Her coffin was taken from Hammersmith through the streets of London to the river, to be embarked for Brunswick. The procession was supposed to bypass the city. The crowds blocked every alternative route. The mourners had to drive the coffin through Hyde Park, where lifeguards fired on the crowd attempting to stop them. 2 people, Richard Honey, a carpenter, and George Francis, a bricklayer, were killed. The inquest, the following month, returned a verdict of willful murder against the soldier who had fired the shot. The verdict was set aside on a technicality. The king was at Holyrood Palace in Edinburgh on the day Caroline died, on the first state visit by a reigning British monarch to Scotland since 1651. The visit, organised by Sir Walter Scott, had been planned for months. The king had insisted on going ahead. He had been clothed by Scott in a kilt of royal Stuart tartan with flesh-coloured tights underneath, on the grounds that his knees were unsuitable for public display. He had wept at the sound of the bagpipes. He had been received with what looked, to a casual observer, like enthusiasm. He had been told of his wife's death by a messenger on the 2nd of August, the day after the public news, while at Dalkeith. He had ordered the court into mourning for 6 weeks and gone on with the visit. The Royal Pavilion had been used to prepare for the coronation through the summer. The cookery for the great feast at Westminster Hall, which followed the Abbey ceremony, was overseen by Carême's successors in the pavilion kitchen. The wine for the feast, including champagne, claret, hock, and Madeira, was shipped in casks from London by way of Brighton. The king, on his return from Scotland in the autumn, came back to the pavilion. He held a small dinner. He sat through it. He was, by every account, exhausted, ill, and victorious in the only way that mattered to him. He was at the height of his power. He was, in the language of his obituary, less regretted by his fellow creatures than any individual the writer could remember. He had thrown his wife out of her own coronation. He had outlived her by less than 10 years. He never set foot in Westminster Abbey again, nor for very long would he set foot in the Royal Pavilion. Chapter 10. The King Who Stopped Coming Out. After 1824, the king who built the Royal Pavilion never set foot in it again. He had returned from Scotland in the autumn of 1821. He had spent the winter at Brighton. He had spent the summer of 1822 in London and Windsor. He had spent the winter of 1822 at Brighton again. He had spent 1823 almost entirely at the pavilion, supervising the final phase of Nash's work and watching the saloon receive its central sun ceiling. He had spent the winter of 1823 at Brighton. He had visited in the early spring of 1824. He had left that spring for the last time. He never came back. The reasons were partly physical and partly emotional. By 1824, he weighed at least 17 stone and may have weighed 20. He suffered from gout in both feet, from dropsy, which made his legs swell, from a chronic chest complaint, and from intermittent attacks of porphyria, the inherited urinary disorder which had driven his father into the long final madness. He used substantial quantities of laudanum, prescribed by his physician, Sir Henry Halford, for sleep and for pain. He could not walk far without help. He had begun to be embarrassed by his own appearance and his own breath. Brighton, which had been a small town when he first arrived in 1783, was now a fashionable resort of more than 20,000 inhabitants, with a chain pier opened in 1823, a sea-wall, a new road from London, and a population of journalists, satirists, and onlookers who watched the pavilion gates from the Stein. The king could not get out of his carriage at his own front door without being stared at. The gardens, although enclosed by Nash within a stone screen, were overlooked from the upper windows of houses along the North Stein. The man who had bought the original farmhouse 40 years before, in order to walk on the beach unrecognised, could no longer leave his own drawing room without becoming an item in the London papers. He retreated to Windsor. From 1824 onwards, he spent most of his life at the Royal Lodge, a comparatively modest cottage in Windsor Great Park, originally a thatched 4-roomed dwelling built by his father, enlarged for him by Nash and Wyatville into a sprawling timber and stucco country house with a low Gothic profile and a private chapel. The Royal Lodge had no public face. It was approached down a long private drive. Outside its gates, the great park provided several thousand acres of woodland into which the king could be driven in a phaeton and never seen. He lived at the Royal Lodge in a small circle. Lady Conyngham was at his side every day, with her husband, her sons, and her daughter installed in nearby apartments. The diarist Charles Greville, who saw the household at close range, described it as a sort of suburban tea party with the king at its head, the conversation small, the food large, the king's mistress holding court at one end of the room while her husband read the paper at the other. There were jewels, there were horses, there were carriages, there were no public dinners, there was no Carême, there were no chandeliers. In London, the pavilion was talked about. Some courtiers asked whether it would be sold, others whether it would be converted to a hospital, others whether it would be demolished. The king would not discuss it. He continued, until the very end, to pay the housekeeper, the gardeners, and a small skeleton staff at Brighton to keep the building habitable. He continued to send for occasional pieces of furniture or porcelain. He never returned in person. His decline through 1825, 1826, 1827, and 1828 was steady. He was treated for dropsy with repeated tappings, in which fluid was drained from his abdomen. He was treated for gout with colchicum. He was treated for pain with laudanum. He was treated for what was probably bladder cancer with poultices and stoicism. He was hauled around the royal lodge in a wheeled chair in his final months. He could not write a letter clearly by 1829. He died at Windsor Castle, in the apartments above the Long Walk, at 20 minutes past 3 in the morning on the 26th of June 1830, of what was probably a ruptured blood vessel in his stomach. He was 67 years, 10 months, and 14 days old. Lady Conyngham, who had been at his side that evening, was not present at the moment of death. The Duke of Cumberland was. Sir Henry Halford was. The chaplain was. His funeral, on the 15th of July 1830, was attended without dignity. His own brother, William IV, who would succeed him, made jokes during the service. The Duke of Wellington stood beside the new king and was heard to remark that he had not seen anything more disgraceful in his life. The coffin was lowered into St. George's Chapel without enthusiasm. The crowds outside the chapel were small. The leading article of the Times on the 15th of July, the morning of the burial, began with the sentence which has fixed his place in British memory ever since. There never was an individual less regretted by his fellow creatures than this deceased king, the article said. What eye has wept for him? What heart has heaved one sob of unmercenary sorrow? The piece went on for 2 columns in the same key. It described his selfishness. It described his ingratitude. It described the wreck of his health, his country, and his marriage. It concluded with the observation that if he had had a friend in any rank of life, that friend was yet to be discovered. The article was widely reprinted. It was not seriously contradicted at the time. It has not been seriously contradicted since. In Brighton, on the same evening, the housekeeper of the Royal Pavilion walked the empty state-rooms with a candle. The dragon chandelier hung in the dark over the banqueting room table. The music room lay silent under its red and gold ceiling. The kitchen was cold. The smoke jack had not turned in 9 years. The man who had built it had died in a small bedroom at Windsor, alone, except for his doctor and his brother, hated, hidden, and at last quiet. Chapter 11. The Queen Who Stripped It Bare. When Queen Victoria first walked into the Royal Pavilion in October 1837, she did not see a palace. She saw an embarrassment. Victoria was 18, the daughter of the Duke of Kent, who had died in 1820 when she was 8 months old. She had been raised at Kensington Palace by her German mother, the Duchess of Kent, and the comptroller of her household, Sir John Conroy. She had been schooled in the principles of plainness, sobriety, family religion, and political moderation that the Victorian middle class would shortly call its own. She had succeeded her uncle William IV on the 20th of June 1837, at the age of 18 years and 1 month. She had been crowned, with as little expense as could be managed, on the 28th of June 1838. William IV, in his short reign from 1830 to 1837, had used the pavilion only briefly. He had visited several times. He had complained about its absurdity. He had ordered an inventory of its contents. He had hosted a few dinners with his Queen Adelaide. He had been, on balance, more amused by the building than offended by it, but he had not loved it. Victoria, on her first visit in October 1837, was offended. She wrote in her journal that the rooms were small, the corridors low, the decorations strange and oriental, and the whole building unsuited to a Queen of England. She came back a second time in 1842, married now to Prince Albert and a mother of 2 children, and she wrote again that the pavilion was not a family house. She came back a third time in 1845. The crowds in the Brighton streets had grown denser. The chain pier sent up its band music in the afternoons. The town had been swallowed by terraces. She felt that she could not walk unobserved in the garden of her own house. She did not come back again. The pavilion stood, locked, with the staff reduced and the carriages no longer ordered down. In 1845, Victoria and Albert had bought, with their own money, Osborne House on the Isle of Wight. Albert, working with Thomas Cubitt, was designing a new Italianate villa on the site of the original 18th century house. The new building, completed by stages between 1846 and 1851, was intended as the family seaside home, which the Royal Pavilion at Brighton was not. It had nurseries. It had gardens reaching down to the Solent. It had a private beach. It had no public. The decision to dispose of the pavilion was, in retrospect, taken in stages. As Osborne rose, Victoria and Albert quietly removed the fittings they wanted: chandeliers, doors, fireplace surrounds, painted ceilings, the magnificent gilt overdoors of the music room, the chinoiserie panels of the saloon, and entire suites of furniture were crated and sent first to Buckingham Palace, then to Windsor Castle, then to Kensington, then on to Osborne. The dragon chandelier itself was removed from the banqueting room and taken to Buckingham Palace, where it hung for over a decade above the new state dining room. By 1847, the pavilion was a shell. The walls remained. The principal movable fittings had been taken. The Brighton vestry, the local elected body, took up the question publicly. The town's commercial interest depended on the pavilion's continuing presence at the heart of the seafront. The townspeople had grown attached to the building over 6 decades. A petition was raised. The Crown agreed, in principle, to sell. The Brighton Royal Pavilion Act passed Parliament in March 1850. The price was fixed at £53,000, payable by the Brighton Commissioners to the Crown. The price was approximately 1/10 of the building's recorded construction cost. The contract had been signed in December 1849. The transfer of ownership was completed on the 19th of June 1850, when the pavilion became the property of the people of Brighton. The Crown's view of this transaction, expressed by the Lord Chamberlain's office in correspondence with the Treasury, was that the building was being disposed of at a generous price to a local authority on the strict understanding that the Crown bore no obligation for its future maintenance. The Brighton view of the transaction, expressed at the public meeting in the new town hall on the day of the transfer, was that the people of Brighton had bought a palace for their grandchildren. The Brighton view, in the long run, has proved the more accurate. What followed was an unusual collaboration between the dynasty that had discarded the building and the town that had acquired it. From 1864 onwards, under the encouragement of Sir John Cole, the Marlborough House superintendent, the Crown began to return fittings to Brighton on long-term loan. The dragon chandelier came back to the banqueting room. The lotus chandeliers came back to the music room. The saloon panels were returned. The painted ceilings were restored. The doors, the fireplaces, and many of the original pieces of furniture made their way home. Over the next century, 5 successive monarchs added to the returns, until by the reign of Elizabeth II, the pavilion was substantially reassembled. The pavilion staff had been dispersed in the 1830s and 40s. The kitchen brigade had shrunk to a single watchman. The footmen and housemaids had taken up positions in other royal households, in London hotels, or in private service elsewhere along the south coast. The royal stables, William Porden's vast circular building behind the pavilion, had been bought separately by the Brighton Corporation and were already in use as a public concert hall. The gardens, Nash's elegant Regency landscape with its serpentine walks and shrubberies, had been opened to the public. Brighton itself, the small town that had grown up around the prince's visits, had changed beyond recognition. The railway from London Bridge had reached the town in 1841, putting Brighton within 90 minutes of central London. The population by 1850 was approaching 70,000. The pavilion sat at the centre of a Victorian seaside city. It had become not a palace, but a public museum, a public hall, and a centre of civic identity. Queen Victoria, who had stripped it, had not loved it. The Queen, who would later become known as the icon of British domesticity, had no use for a building designed for the entertainment of 200 guests at a time in a foreign style. She had set the pattern for the modern royal family, which is the pattern of strict private domesticity for public consumption. The pavilion belonged to an older pattern, in which the monarch lived in semi-public theatre, in elaborate rooms designed for the display of personal taste. The two patterns were incompatible. One had to go. The pavilion went. Chapter 12. The Palace That Outlived Its King. The most hated king in modern British history left behind the most beautiful pleasure palace in Europe. It was not, in 1830, a fact anyone could have predicted. The pavilion, in 1830, was a stripped, empty building inherited by a brother who did not love it, then by a niece who actively wanted to be rid of it. It was the personal whim of a man whose conduct, marriage, and spending had brought the institution of monarchy nearer to the edge of constitutional reform than it had been since the 17th century. It was unsuited to the new world. It was, in any reasonable estimation, doomed. What saved it was, in the first place, the town. Brighton had grown around the prince's presence. The pavilion was the visible reason for that growth. To demolish it would have been to demolish the founding building of the modern town. The Brighton commissioners, the Brighton vestry, and the local press of the 1840s were united in defending the structure. The £53,000 raised in 1850 by means of a corporation loan was paid down over the following decades by a combination of admission fees, hall rentals, and modest local taxation. The pavilion paid for itself within a generation. What saved it in the second place was the crown itself. The same dynasty which had stripped it returned, slowly and over more than a century, to put back what it had taken. The crown's relationship with the building shifted from embarrassment to embarrassment overcome, from quiet shame to public pride. By the time of the reign of Edward VII, who was a sympathetic figure to a certain kind of Regency excess, the pavilion was a national curiosity. By the time of George V, it was a national treasure. By the time of George VI, it was a hospital. During the Great War of 1914 to 1918, the pavilion was opened as a military hospital for Indian soldiers serving in the British Army. The men of the Punjabi, Sikh, and Gurkha regiments, who had been wounded in France, were sent to Brighton because the building was felt, in its oriental detail, to be a fitting setting in which they could recuperate. The kitchens were converted to ward kitchens. The banqueting room held ranks of beds. Over the 4 years of the war, approximately 12,000 Indian patients passed through the building. 53 died and were cremated on the South Downs in the first cremations of Hindu soldiers performed on British soil, a fact marked today by the Chattree Memorial above the village of Patcham, north of Brighton. What saved it in the third place was the survival of beauty itself. Even those who hated the Prince Regent agreed that John Nash's silhouette of onion domes, set against the sea and the chalk downs, was a thing without parallel in Europe. Even those who hated the Prince Regent's pleasures admitted that the dragon chandelier, the lotus chandeliers, the palm columns, and the long gallery were achievements of decorative art which could not be replicated. Beauty, as the pavilion teaches, outlives the people who paid for it. It outlives even those who paid for it badly. The pavilion in the 20th century survived several near disasters. On the 17th of February 1975, a fire, probably caused by an electrical fault, broke out in the music room. It destroyed much of the ceiling, the carpet, and the wall canvases by Robert Jones. The restoration, undertaken by the Sussex County Council, the City of Brighton, and the Department of the Environment, took 11 years. The music room reopened in 1986. In the great storm of the 16th of October 1987, the south of England was hit by hurricane-force winds, which uprooted 15 million trees. At the Royal Pavilion, a stone ball, weighing roughly half a ton, was torn from the top of one of the minarets and fell through the lead roof of the music room onto the floor of the new restoration. The repair took a further 4 years. The music room reopened, fully restored a second time in 1991. The pavilion today is open to the public every day of the year, except Christmas Day. It is owned by Brighton and Hove City Council. It is managed by Brighton and Hove Museums Trust. It receives approximately 300,000 visitors a year. The banqueting room contains the original dragon chandelier, returned from Buckingham Palace in 1864. The great kitchen contains the cast-iron palm columns, the steam table, the smoke jack, and a long oak table on which Carême's menu of the 18th of January 1817 is reproduced on a tea towel sold in the gift shop. The music room contains its lotus chandeliers, restored twice. The saloon contains its great central sun ceiling. The King's apartments contain his private library. Queen Victoria's apartments above contain a small case of her early letters. The man who built it lies in the Royal Vault at St. George's Chapel, Windsor. His brother William and his niece Victoria lie nearby. His wife Caroline lies in Brunswick. His Catholic wife, Maria Fitzherbert, lies in St. John the Baptist Church in Brighton, less than a mile from the building he built and she half lived in. His daughter Charlotte lies at Windsor, in the chapel where she would have been crowned. His mistresses are scattered across English country churchyards. Of the man himself, nothing of personal beauty remains. His clothes were sold. His debts were paid by the country. His books were returned to the Royal Library. His portraits by Lawrence and Beechey hang in the Royal Collection, where they show a beautiful young man and a swollen old one. His obituary stands on the front page of the Times of the 15th of July, 1830, a document of 200 years of standing reproach. What does it mean, in the end, that the most unloved king's most extravagant project became the most loved building of his entire dynasty? Perhaps it means that beauty is a separate problem from goodness, and that history rewards the first more easily than it forgives the absence of the second. Perhaps it means that buildings can be loved by people who refuse to love their builders, and that the visiting public, walking through the banqueting room beneath the dragon, see only the dragon, not the king who paid for it. Perhaps it means that the Royal Pavilion, by surviving him, has become its own argument for him, the only argument left after Caroline, after Maria, after Charlotte, after Carême, after the bills, after the obituary, after the silence. The pavilion stands. The man who built it does not. That is the only honest summary of his reign, and it is the only honest summary of the British class system that produced him. A country which built that building, by means of that king, by the methods used to pay for it, deserves, in the end, the building it kept and the memory it earned. It is a beautiful palace. It belongs now to the public who never met its owner. That is perhaps the most just outcome history could have arranged. And it is the proof, if proof were needed, that the pavilion has outlived everyone who hated it, including the man who loved it most, and that is a longer life than most kings achieve. If you want more stories like this one, where the building outlives the legend, subscribe and stay with me. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from tonight, and whether you think the Royal Pavilion ought to have been demolished in 1850 or saved. Share the story with anyone who loves the dark side of English history. You are the reason I keep going.